answer and what not to do. I've done things in ways that you probably would not want to try at home. This is not necessarily the model. So at least this can be a model for what to avoid in your own pathway. A couple of the things that Ed asked me to think about as I talked with you today, one was to talk about the challenges that I faced along the way. And I'm going to try to weave that in throughout. And also, please feel to interrupt me at any time and ask if there's something that comes up that you'd like to ask about. He also asked me to talk about the ways that I've combined basically being a mom, my work and family, how those have worked together throughout my pathway as well. And again, please don't hesitate to stop and ask me a question if anything comes up. So Jordan and I alluded to this. In terms of my research focus and the focus shared by everyone in my lab, we tend to focus on parenting, and in particular the ways that parents communicate with their children about emotions, and in general how that relates to children's positive social development. So when we talk about emotion socialization, that includes ways that parents use emotions to teach their children about what they would like to see. So for example, does a parent talk in an extra happy tone of voice when talking with their child about the good grade the child just got on their math test? Does a parent express anger to try to get a child to stop hitting their little sister with a Tommy truck? Does a child express contempt? Does a parent express contempt? Does a parent express pride? So the ways that emotions can highlight the socialization messages that parents send. That also includes parents' direct communication about emotions. So we can probably think of many cliches, sort of the big kids don't cry being one of them, the ways that parents directly communicate with their children about emotions. And in the lab, we look at how those affect child positive social development. What's meant by that is the ways that children develop emotional and social skills that help them to behave adaptively in social context, to be pro-social with your peers, to show helping behavior, sharing behaviors. We've also looked at the converse sometimes too, and I know Jordan has talked to you about our work with families with a child with oppositional defiant disorder. These are kids who tend to be very argumentative and hostile, and who tend to act out in ways that harm other people. So even within those families, we'd be looking for resilience in terms of not showing as much of those symptoms, and also being able to show adaptive social functioning despite having those symptoms. And then I've got this all in this big blue circle called cultural context, because in the lab we do recognize that all of this is taking place within a particular culture. Sometimes we've studied that explicitly. For instance, with my collaborator, Amy Halberstadt, we've worked with African American, European American, and Lumbee Native American families to look at different beliefs about emotions and how those affect the parenting strategies that families choose. And sometimes it's more implicit, such as when we simply recognize that what works in one particular cultural context might not work the same way in another cultural context. So we really try to keep in mind that the meaning of what parents are communicating about emotions is likely to vary depending on the family's cultural context. Okay, so that's the research focus. Just moving chronologically, starting with my early influences. This is my family. This is actually right before my high school graduation from Radford High School, 30 minutes down the road. I'm one of the few academics who actually got to go home during my career. That's me, in case you couldn't tell. This is my brother, Hollis Dunsmore, who has ever lived. My sister Sarah, my dad, and my mom. So my mom would be very upset with me for showing this picture because she lost her mom right after I graduated high school, and she became a kid at home. But you can see you're all pretty happy in that picture. The reason I put my family up here in terms of an influence on my research is that my father is a minister. And that affected my research interest in a few ways. One of them is that we moved a lot when I was growing up. He's in a Methodist church, and in this particular conference, we would move about every 3 to 4 years. The longest I ever lived anywhere when I was growing up was 5 years. And even though it was all within the sort of Southwest Virginia, East Tennessee area, that still exposed us to different cultures. We do that in 2 ways, and you can probably sort of imagine here, growing up in Blacksburg is different from growing up in Christiansburg. There's a little bit different culture in the 2 towns. So even if in other ways the towns might be similar, for instance, we lived in Tazewell, we lived in Radford, we lived in Lebanon, all areas in Southwest and some of them in far Southwest Virginia, there's a little bit different flavor to each of the places we lived. Another way that I learned about cultures that, as a minister, my father often hosted people in other countries. So in a more stark way, we got to learn about culture in that way from different nations' beliefs about what was appropriate. Those of you who are involved in church activities may know this already, but it's not a one-person job, it's a two-person job. My mother worked outside the home sometimes when I was growing up, but always she had that full-time job as a minister's wife, the pastor's wife jobs never ends. So one way that she affected my research interest was her focus on precision. She was an English teacher in high school. She was very on to us all the time about being really precise about what you're communicating. I'm not going to tell you what she would do, but she would let us know that she wanted us to not be sloppy about how we were communicating. As a researcher, that's carried over too, and you can probably think of ways in your own research. You have to be really clear about what you mean and what you don't in research. So she sort of set that as a value throughout life by the way that she taught my brother, my sister, and me. Another thing that they both emphasized through my father's work in the church was trying to understand people emotionally. So obviously there was a great influence on morals. That's part of being religious. But my dad would often think about how you can have the right thing to do, but if you don't do it in the right way, you end up with the wrong outcome. So taking into account how are people responding emotionally to things that are happening in the church, whether that judgment or the decision by the board is right or wrong, whether the action by a church member is right or wrong, it's also about how is that communicated to people emotionally. And then finally, my brother and sister, I was the youngest, so of course part of how they influenced me was by picking on me all the time when I was growing up. But they were both very invested in trying to find ways to help people in the future. My sister is now a program officer at the National Institute of Developmental Science. She's a molecular biologist. The application of her work is basically to cancer. She studies regeneration of type 2 cells in the lung, which is all I know about what she studies. But the application is to cancer. She wants to help improve people's ability to recover, to live after cancer. My brother, until his death, was the director of development at a couple of different medical schools. So his work is raising money to fund the research that could then go into helping save people's lives. So the whole family, we had that sort of mission as a family that we need to do something that's going to help the world. I really liked kids. I chose to go into developmental psychology. They probably could have seen that coming. I babysat a lot when I was growing up. As I mentioned, for my undergraduate years, I went to Emory University in Atlanta. And I've got two pictures up here. This gentleman here is Dick Neisser. He's a cognitive psychologist. He actually passed last year. He was known in some ways as the father of cognitive psychology because he came to his sort of professional career at that time when behaviorism was the predominant theme in psychology. And what he added was that, yes, behavior is important, but the way people think is also important. So in terms of my research interest, what I learned through working with Dr. Neisser for my honors thesis, well, two things. Again, that precision in terms of operationalization of constructs. He was very careful about experimental design, but also how to take into account both the way that people approach situations as well as the behaviors that they show. That it's not just what you're seeing, it's also how people are interpreting what you're seeing. And in my work today, I do a lot about parents' beliefs about emotions and how those beliefs may drive different parenting behaviors, may motivate different parenting behaviors. And I see that as a direct result of the time I spent working with him. Robin Fivish, here on the, I guess that's the right for you. She was one of my undergrad professors. She was the only woman I had as a professor in psychology, which seems kind of strange, even at that time. Psychology, especially developmental psychology, is a field that tends to draw women. But yet she was the only undergraduate, the only female professor in psychology I had as an undergraduate. And she was also, at that time, an assistant professor. She was going up for tenure right as I was getting ready to graduate. And she was very appropriate about how she communicated that she was willing to talk about that process of what it was like to be teaching, doing research, having her own life, and trying to get tenure at a research one university. So she was a very foundational influence in terms of me trying to get an idea that this was something that I could do. One of the challenges I faced coming from Southwest Virginia to Emory University was that I had a very narrow view of what was possible for me. You know, even despite the fact that my parents were both professionals, I didn't know a lot about psychology. I didn't know what kinds of careers were possible. I thought there was only clinical psychology. And so it really took working with researchers and having that role model of a female researcher who was getting tenure at research university to really think, this might be possible for me too. To sort of imagine myself in that kind of job. One of the neat things now is that when I go to conferences, our major conference is called the Society for Research in Child Development, obviously because we study children and their development. I run into her all the time, and she's so great about it. She doesn't make me feel like I'm still this little undergraduate. She will introduce me to people, and she's like, I think so in her development, as if it's something to be proud of. So to have someone who I look up to treat me as an equal is a really nice validation and continuation. Okay, so I mentioned that I had a very naive view of psychology. And even though through my undergraduate years I got exposed to other fields, I still had that sort of mindset that I want to help people, and the only way to do that is to work directly with them as a counselor. So when I applied to graduate schools, I applied in clinical psychology. My research interests were always in children's normative development. I had a lot of experience working in child care. I had done that every summer to help pay my way through college. And I was really interested in the way that children gained emotional skills, but I thought, you know, I can do that on the side. I'll be a clinician, maybe I'll teach a course here and there, maybe I'll do a little research on the side. So I applied to clinical programs. I very naively applied to level 3, which if you've ever heard that, that was a stupid thing to do. It should have been more like 15. But I was lucky, I got in, and I went to Duke for my doctoral training. My advisor was Phil Costanzo. Phil's a little bit of a maverick. He is trained as a social psychologist, as well as a clinician, and he does developmental work, despite having no training in it. He was a perfect fit for me because of that, because I came to him in the clinical program, really having no interest in clinical research, and wanting to study basic social development. He was thrilled. He was like, let's go do it. And one of the ways that he's been helpful continually is he has an incredibly inflated view of my capacities. He'll read something I've written, he thinks, you should submit this to JPSB, which is our top journal. I'm like, that's crazy. There's no way. It's got 40 subjects. But he has this overwhelming confidence, which, even though I can recognize it's outflated, it's nice to know I've got this person having my back all the time. Always seeing the positive in my point of view. The person on your right here is Barb Fredrickson. Barb came to Duke when I was in my 3rd year in the program. She's a social psychologist, and Jordan may have talked about her work in here before. She's founded the field of positive psychology, basically. She studies happiness and other positive emotions from a multidimensional perspective. She looks at a variety of psychophysiological indices, as well as, of course, self-important observational indices. So she came to Duke, and she was starting the tenure track there, and I was just at that point in my progress where I needed to get the dissertation together. And because I was trying to combine positive psychology with child development, Phil suggested that I get Barb to be my co-chair for my dissertation. So there are a couple of ways in which that was really helpful. One is that just that model of collaboration. A lot of faculty can be pretty possessive of their grad students, but Phil wasn't. His attitude was, we're all going to benefit by you getting expertise in this other lab. So that sort of openness to, we're all in this together, and we're all going to benefit by every one of us being successful, that's something I've really tried to carry forward with me. I thought that was how science should be, right? And then the other way is that not only was Barb introducing me to these new concepts in the study of emotion from a positive psychology perspective, but again, she was a young woman starting the tenure track, and though in a very appropriate way, she let me know what were the presses at a Research One university. What was it going to likely be like trying to get tenure at a Research One university? So both personally and professionally, I felt like I learned a lot from that in terms of you set out your program of research, you carve out this little piece to focus on for your dissertation, and you really think about what are the things I can carve out that can be publications that I need to get submitted to eventually get tenure one day. What can I be thinking ahead to to eventually get tenure one day?
said a Research One University?
Research One, yeah. Are you familiar with that terminology? Okay. I think it's the Carnegie Institute, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that ranks universities. Research One basically is the highest tier. I think it's called actually very high research now instead of Research One. But it means the faculty there, their focus is more on getting grants and conducting basic research than it is on the teaching mission of the university. So it's different from, say, a comprehensive university where the balance is going to be a little bit more teaching. And there's that focus on getting external funding at the Research One. There's less of that at a comprehensive university. And then they have the whole ranking system down. I don't know all of it, but I know that there's something about sort of like state satellite universities. So sort of like what UNC Wilmington would be a state satellite university, whereas UNC Chapel Hill is sort of the flagship of the UNC system. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so you remember that I started graduate school thinking that I was going to mostly be a clinician and do a little research on the side. And yet, my interests were only in normative development. About my third year, it occurred to me that it was really silly for me to pursue being a clinician when my research interests were in normative development. There was nothing that being a clinician was going to buy me in terms of the research I would be able to do. I liked clinical work. It's very compelling to be able to help someone face to face. But I was also getting married about this time, and I knew I wanted to have kids, and I was thinking ahead to, is there enough time in the day to do everything I wanted to do? I had discovered through teaching my own courses as part of my graduate funding that I really liked teaching. I knew I loved my research. I didn't want to let that go. And my husband was a clinician too. I sort of had this idea, well, he can do the clinical stuff. And then I'll do the research and teaching. So I went to Phil, my third year in the clinical program, and said, I think I really want to switch to developmental. And I thought it was going to be this hard conversation. He was like, yes, you're actually going to do research. He was so excited about it. Barb was excited too, and she does no clinical work. She was like, that gives you more time for research. It makes perfect sense. And though I didn't talk about it that much, but they knew too that I was thinking of starting a family before too long. And I think they were thinking about there's just only so many hours of the day. You can't do everything sometimes. If it's not going to buy you what you need with your research, why get the clinical degree? Why do the extra internship year? Why take the time away from the research for that? Nonetheless, because I've been in the clinical program, I felt like I needed more research experience before I would be competitive for a tenure-track position. So I applied for an National Research Service Award from NIH. And I was fortunate enough to get it, to work with Amy Halberstadt at NC State. And there's my smiling collaborator here. Amy and I are still good buddies. We still collaborate to this day. What I learned from her, well, there's so much, but one of the things in particular is we focus a lot on observational methodology. I had done some of that in my coursework at Duke, some of that in my research experience at Duke, but she really helped me focus on videotaping naturalistic parent-child interactions and then figuring out how to quantify those. And at this point, that's the bread and butter of my lab. That's what Jordan spends about 30 hours a week doing with his time, is watching these naturalistic situations and finding ways to quantify them so that we can test whether the patterns of parent-child communication that we're seeing really are connected to better child outcomes. The other thing that Amy did that still informs the way that I work today is when I told her I was pregnant, 2 months into my postdoc, she did not get upset with me. She was like, Mazel tov, let's go look at breast pumps together. She was thrilled. She looked at it as her opportunity to help someone in a way that she wished that she could help when she had her own children. So she looked at it as an opportunity that I was having a child. We talked about we're going to stack data collection here and give you a few months here where you don't have to be in the lab, but you can be writing manuscripts at home if you're able to at least get a shower as you take care of your newborn child. And you can see this is my son Nick when he was about 4 months old then, me, my sister, and my brother. So I've tried to take that into my lab too, that the attitude that Amy got across to me is, of course your work is important to you, but it's not your whole life. Life is life, and your work is a really important part. So that sense of there are priorities, it's okay for you to have other priorities than work. It's not always going to come first. I may not like me saying that, but I just said it. My sister, as you might recall, is a molecular biologist. At this time, she had just finished. Yeah, she had just finished her postdoc. She did a postdoc at Hershey in Pennsylvania. And what she said to me when she found out I was pregnant was, well, there goes your PhD. It's worthless now. So you have to understand the context of our relationship. She's my sister. She can say that. No one else can say that to me, but she can say that to me. So part of what was also fun, and you can, I think, see this in her picture, is that she's such a devoted aunt. She was so delighted with Nicholas and with the idea that she was going to have this nephew in the world now, that her attitude changed from you're throwing away your PhD to you'll find a way. You'll figure out how you can keep doing your research. Maybe it won't be at the same pace as it would be for someone who doesn't have a child, but you'll figure out a way. And to be fair, in her field, she really was into the lab late at night because, and I don't understand it at all, but apparently if you don't do things at exactly the right time, you lose the whole mouse that you've been working with. Does that sound familiar to you? Okay, so after the postdoc, this was actually my last year on the postdoc. I was getting ready to go on the job market. I had an 8-month-old baby who was still nursing every 2 hours throughout the day. And I was trying to imagine how was I going to go, give a job talk somewhere, maybe somewhere completely across the country. Got lots of advice from lots of people. And Amy's really radical. You may have figured this out through the story. She said, take them with you. You're a developmental psychologist. If people can't handle you breastfeeding your child, then they should not be a developmental psychologist. So I did. I ended up taking my son on my job search. Please don't do this. There are a number of reasons not to do it, but one way it was helpful for me is that it kept me in mind of these are what my priorities are. And I think it actually showed the places that I went to. I ended up only going on 2 interviews, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. It showed them that I could handle my work because I was very professional about it. I was able to have babysitters each place I went. And then I was like, I just need a 15-minute break, and I would pump during the day so I could get through the day. The babysitter took care of him, but I was with him at night, and that worked out. So I think it showed them that I had my stuff together. That yes, I'm a young mother, I'm also a professional person. Again, it's a risk to do that, but I was at the point where I felt like if I'm going to go somewhere that's really put off by this, and yes, as a developmental psychologist, would someone really put off by this? That's a place I don't want to be. I would rather flip burgers than go a place that was not going to be welcoming to me and my child. So I did apply to some Research One universities, but I targeted mostly liberal arts colleges. And you'll recall that I really enjoyed teaching. I still really enjoy teaching. The liberal arts colleges I applied to were all places where, though teaching is the mission, they provide a lot of support for research too. I had a friend, Marian Underwood, who was very happy at a similar place at Reed College in Washington, and she felt like it was really ideal for her, that she enjoyed that interaction with the undergraduate students, helping them progress, and helping them grow, helping them get into graduate school, and at the same time she felt like she was able to keep her research program going. It was at a slower pace than it would have been otherwise, but she felt very satisfied. So I went to Hamilton College, which is very close to Colgate, where Ed Sumgett is going to be going. And it is like that. It's very intensive teaching. I had a 2-3 course load there, and those of you who are getting close to the job market may know that's actually not all that different than a lot of research universities. However, the teaching there, what counts as good teaching is really different than what counts as good teaching at a research university. For instance, writing intensive courses, when I came to Tech, I actually did the math. At Hamilton, I had to do 3 times as many writing assignments for the course to count as a writing intensive course compared to what the guidelines were at Tech when I first moved here. So it has the reward that you really do get to know students, you really do get to see the undergraduates grow. I would have students as first-year students, sophomores, juniors, seniors, so I really would see them year to year, and I don't get that here for the most part. It had the downside that the teaching is really intensive. So what I found there is I was doing research basically in the summers and needing to do 2 or 3 summers of data collection to do what I could do in a semester if I was here. I was going to include a picture of the snow there too, which when I first went there that first winter, I thought, oh my gosh. We would have snow on the ground from Halloween through Mother's Day every year. It would literally be this tall. My kids would make tunnels in the snow in our yard. And the fire hydrants, they lift them this far off so that if there's a fire in the winter, they don't have to dig a hydrant up before they put the fire out. So it was a different world that way too. And I actually ended up enjoying it, except for getting the kids into snowsuits every day. As you can see here, my daughter is joining moms in Hamilton. That's my brother behind her. He's a big Tennessee Volunteers fan. He had big hopes that she would become a lady ball someday. I don't think that's going to happen. She's tiny. I don't think that's going to happen, but that was his hope for her. So Hamilton is a liberal arts college, like I said. Teaching is more of the focus there, though there is a lot of attention paid to student research and to faculty members providing that. As Jordan mentioned, I stayed long enough to get tenure. There are a lot of things I liked about it. One of the things I liked was that there were truly interdisciplinary opportunities. And we have interdisciplinary work here. They had wildly, crazily interdisciplinary opportunities there. There was one project I was involved with the campus chaplain, the head of the theater department, someone from comparative literature, someone from English, someone from sociology, and me as a psychologist. So it was really a lot of very disparate fields, and that was fun. That was fun just to get these really different points of view. And what was hard was twofold. One is that I really did not have the time to do research during the school year because of the demands of keeping the teaching at a quality level that was expected at this institution. And then the second is that for the scope of research I was starting to imagine, I didn't think I would ever have the resources to be able to do it. Not just in terms of money, but just in terms of, it was a fairly rural area. It would take me years and years to build up a sample size that would be appropriate for the kind of statistical analysis I wanted to do. So I started looking for something else, and Virginia Tech had just started what's called the Developmental Sciences Initiative. It was a joint operation between psychology and human development, which both have developmental psychologists, to try to increase the presence of developmental scientists on campus. At Hamilton, I was the only developmental psychologist. So even within the psychology department, I was always having to explain why it's scientific to observe children in their natural habitat. Here, I would be surrounded by people who were developmental scientists who shared a lot of the same assumptions, and who at the same time could introduce me to related concepts in their own fields. So for instance, to infant perception, to the way friendships are formed in old age, and so on. So I interviewed here and was delighted with the folks here and moved here in 2003. This is my kids shortly after we moved here. They're actually in my lab. That's my playroom right there. Nick and Elizabeth. And then this is them just before the holidays. So 10 years of time here, seeing observers at home. Here are some of the things that have been challenging here. It is actually pretty easy to make that transition from Hamilton to here for two reasons. One is that my teaching was very well set. After teaching at a liberal arts college, the courses here are a breeze for me to have. You know, it's not requiring quite as much of me, and it's actually, especially the graduate courses, it's pretty fun to be expanding what I've been doing before. The quality of the students, we had very good students at Hamilton. I had very good students here. The one difference I would say in terms of the undergraduates is that Hamilton had really, really good writers. Every course students took there would count as a writing intensive course here. So of course, by the time they were seniors, they were really good writers. Here, we get some star writers at every course, but it's a little bit more of trying to help them develop. But for the students who work in the lab, they're easily the equivalent of the undergraduate students I had at Hamilton. I'm looking at Jordan because you can attest to that too, good work. And my graduate students, it's really rewarding to get to watch them grow over time too, and move on into the future. So that transition was pretty easy. The transition in terms of getting my lab started up, it wasn't hard, partly because Jack Finney, who was the chair at the time, really gave me the resources I needed. His attitude was, you tell me what you need to succeed, I'll give it to you, and get out of your way. Yes, Tristan?
They didn't, when you were going to your first, did they do the same thing, or you had to?
That's a good question. When I went to the first place, they were willing to buy me some equipment. And I have the feeling that I cost them more than any other psychologist ever had before at that time. Because I needed an observation room and I needed video cameras. So they renovated a room so I could have a little room that we call a control room that would look out onto a playroom. They put in the glass there, and they bought some pretty fancy video equipment for me. What they spent was a lot for liberal arts college. It would have been barely adequate for a research university. So I don't want to say they weren't generous. They were generous, but there were different expectations for the research you're going to do. Let me give you another example. One of my friends at Hamilton is a physicist, and she needed a laser for her work. And it took 5 years for them to be able to get it together to do the laser. They wanted to do it. They were willing to do it. They just said, look, we have to do it a little bit in terms of putting money aside, and then they were able to get it. I think they actually ended up getting it because it came through for her. So they did get the equipment, but their expectation isn't you're going to be doing a lot of time during research. It was you're going to be doing some research, especially some research with your students, but your main focus is your teaching. I think it's changed a little bit now. What I've heard is they now have an eye tracker, which is really expensive equipment, and I think they were able to get that through the too. So it's not like you can't get good equipment, but that there are different expectations about what is the scale of the equipment you're going to need. And there's a little bit more of an attitude of what can you get by with, whereas here it was, what do you need to make this really good? Does that make sense?
So you had to juggle these types of questions when you were going to your job search, like going to do more research, like teaching or balance?
Absolutely. I had to be ready to answer that. And I don't know if you've talked about job searches in this forum before, but of course I would do my homework at each place, so I knew what to expect. I wouldn't apply to a place that I thought I wouldn't fit in. But I did have sort of a range of, I could see myself here to here. Does that make sense? Another thing I did with my research was try to figure out what is already existing in the department. So for instance, if they already had a video suite, my questions would be more about would I be able to use that? If they didn't, then it would be can we build that? Okay, so challenges here, obviously the search for grant funding. That's something I think about every single day because we need the funding to bring the families in to do the research, to pay the people who are going to work with the families and do the coding and so on. The liberal arts college, they would have loved it if I got a grant, but it was not an expectation. Here, I needed to do it to do the research. The department, however, has been far more family-friendly here, partly because my time is my own. So Hamilton so much needed to be spent with face-to-face contact with the students that I ended up with pretty constrained schedules every day. Here, I have a lot more flexibility with my schedule, and the department is also just really good about, like the department chair never schedules a department meeting on a day when Montgomery County schools are closed, because he doesn't want to create hardship, but he doesn't have to. I'm open to other questions, but I want to just point out my former grad students, because Ed asked me to talk about them. Dr. Marie Bell, Perez Rivera, Dr. Paher, Dr. Corey Whitmore. Those are the 3 students I've graduated so far. They're all happy in their positions. They're all continuing their research and involved in academics in one way or another. I'll tell you more about the positions if you want to know. And my current grad students, who I could not get along without, Amy Neal, Jordan, who you know, and Rachel Miller. Ed had asked me, what do I see as the sort of critical traits for successful grad students? And one thing I think all of my students share, both former and current, is a true passion for their research. They really want to know the answers to the questions that they're studying. I don't think there's a substitute for that. There has to be that intrinsic motivation about the topic that you're studying. And then another thing that I think is really critical that they all share is an attitude when I get feedback about a project. It doesn't mean I'm a terrible person with no skills. It means I need to fix something about this project. And that, again, so much of academics is about submitting something, having to revise it, initial rejection, and eventually getting it in. It can be an exercise in delayed gratification. So I think having that attitude is really helpful, that perseverance and that attitude. It's not about me, it's about the product. There are ways to fix this and make it better. I don't want to talk forever. I want to give you time to ask questions if you want. So I'm going to stop here.
Okay. I think Dr. Dunsmore forgot to post have excellent prep scholars.
I did not post Sheena and Tiffany.
Yes.
Who are both doing very well. They're not
they're doing PhD. They're excellent. One of them was an activity from campus. One day I just got up, I told her, for the time she's holding a sign of protesting. You know?
Yeah.
All right, very good. Excellent. Yeah. And you've had an IMSD undergraduate too. She's
That's
a
right.
peak now.
Jasmine Williams,
Okay.
who's in a PhD program in applied developmental psychology now. Yeah, she did wonderful.
All right, questions for...
Yes, Nina.
So you talked a lot about writing, and obviously in grad school you do a lot of writing and different types of writing.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, I think we all have those moments where you're trying to write something and you just can't write. So I was just wondering if you had any tips or suggestions or sort of advice about how you got through those, like any, I guess, tricks of the trade.
Here's two contradictory tips for you. The first one is to take a break from it. Just getting out, walking around the building sometimes is enough to get my jitters out and be able to concentrate again. And the second one, and this was especially after I had kids. Before I had kids, I thought, I need a chunk of time to write. After I had kids, I was like, I got 10 minutes, I can get something down. So getting something down, even if it's bad, I would always far rather revise what I've written than try to write something fresh. And it's not rocket science, that's the best I can give you, but those are the two things that worked for me.
Can you say something about the was it called F-32 at the time? For your postdoc, you had a
That's right.
grant. Okay.
Yeah, it was an F-32. It's called the Ruth L. Kirchstein
It's just called that.
Yeah. And there are two different types of those. There are institutional ones where an institution like UNC Chapel Hill will have a certain amount of slots that you apply to. And then there's the individual where you write your own grant to work with the mentor of your choice. And if it gets funded, then you get to do that. The second one is the kind that I had. And that was maybe another thing. It was really risky to do that. It might not have worked out. But I had the attitude I was trying to support myself because it doesn't work out. This was a study I really wanted to do. And Amy Halberstadt was the perfect person to do it with. And that's the one thing they look for is your mentor appropriate for the project that you're trying to do. So it was worth the risk to do that. I also had the attitude, if this doesn't get funded, I'll turn it into another grant too. So that the work wouldn't go to waste. But it was a risk that paid off.
How did you make that initial contact with her? I guess to propose the idea to her, and then also had she had any other postdocs that had did the same at 32 and was successful with her?
Two great questions. In terms of how I made the contact with her, I cold emailed her. I knew her a little bit because in the research triangle, UNC Chapel Hill, NC State, and UNC Greensboro have a joint venture called the Center for Developmental Science, where they're a monthly colloquia. So I had seen her at those. I was painfully shy. I had never introduced myself. But I knew her work through that, and I knew she would be a good mentor for that. So I cold emailed her. I said, this is my idea. Could I please come talk about it with you? And she was open to me coming to talk about it with her. She wasn't willing to sign on to doing it, of course, until she had met with me and got a sense of who was I and what was my work like. But it was enough, she was intrigued enough, and it didn't cost her anything either. It cost her a 30-minute meeting to do that first meeting and figure out, was this something she wanted to pursue further for me? What was the second part of your question?
Had she had another postdoc?
Yeah, I was her first postdoc ever. So in retrospect, that was a risk on my part. I did not know what kind of postdoc mentor she would be. And she was really clear, like, I've had graduate students who I've mentored through the dissertation, but I haven't had postdocs before, so we'll have to see how this goes. But it worked out, and I think a lot of it because we were able to be very straightforward in our communication with each other. This is what I'm worried about, this is what we can do about that. In terms of contacting people in general for postdocs, I think people, at the very least would be flattered to be contacted. It might not be right in terms of what we are doing at that moment, but they're never going to feel offended that you want to do a postdoc with them. And at the best case scenario, it can work out to be a long-term collaborative relationship. Yes.
A question about funding. So it sounds like at the liberal arts school, you were focused more on teaching us emotional research. So I'm assuming there you wouldn't really have enough data to do any sort of funding applications?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay. So I'm giving 2 answers to everything. Here's 2 answers to this. In terms of pilot data, it was pretty, I could collect enough pilot data over the course of the year. What I could not do was convince the funding agency that I could ramp up the rate of data collection during the school year. So if they had funded me, it would have meant, say, 5 years to do a project that someone at a Research 1 could do in 2. The other piece that I want to give that, which is the second answer, is that for the college, what they care about is, are their undergraduates getting into graduate school? So they want to make sure that the research I'm doing provides opportunities for undergraduates. Fortunately, it was, and that was really rewarding to help the undergraduates. And in fact, my first one from undergrad is now an assistant track professor at New York University, which is kind of neat to see too. But so for the college, they were more about, are undergrads getting the research experience they need, instead of, are you doing the research that you need to do?
Okay.